the AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome. Good morning. I'm Janine Berg from the International Labour Organization, and jointly with my colleague Pawel Gmyrek, we are co-moderators of this joint ITU-ILO session on AI for Work. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Duncan Crabtree-Ireland. He's the chief negotiator of SAG-AFTRA. SAG-AFTRA is the Screen Actors Guild American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. He was the key leader of the successful merger between SAG and AFTRA in 2012 and was the principal architect of SAG-AFTRA's landmark pandemic safety response and return to work initiatives. He led the union's historic 2023 TV theatrical contract negotiations and strike, which we will be discussing today. During his career with the organization, he has personally led or overseen contract negotiations for SAG-AFTRA's television, film, streaming, video games, commercials, music, network television, and Telemundo Spanish language contracts, among others. For those of you who aren't familiar with SAG-AFTRA, it was established in the 1930s. And it has a long history of negotiating protections for its members. Today, it represents approximately 160,000 people, actors, announcers, broadcast journalists, dancers, DJs, news writers, news editors, even puppeteers. So it's a wide range of people that it's representing. And their work can be seen in theaters, on television and radio, sound recordings, the internet, in games, on mobile devices, and of course on home video. So in today's conversation, we are going to cover SAG-AFTRA's concerns and response to the potential use of artificial intelligence in the media and culture industries, their highly publicized strike in 2023, as well as other ongoing negotiations in the gaming industry, changes in the media and culture business model and their implications, as well as other issues. But let's start with the topic that brings us here today, which is basically the breakdown of negotiations in July 2023, which led to a 118-day-long strike against their counterpart, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. Could you explain to us, Duncan, what were the main sticking points that led to the breakdown in negotiations, and very specifically, particularly for this audience, what were the concerns and demands of your membership around artificial intelligence?
Certainly. And first of all, let me just say, Janina and Pawel, thank you so much for the chance to be here and have this conversation. I think, it is a really it's a fascinating topic, hopefully, but it's also one that I think really highlights how challenging the first years of implementation, especially of advanced generative AI tools in the media and entertainment industry is, and also the opportunity we have, if we handle it correctly, to help channel the direction of AI implementation into a more human-centered and uplifting experience, rather than one that is entirely scary or tears people down. Although I think it's important to recognize from the very beginning that the disruption that has already been caused by AI will continue, and it is part of any kind of real and honest engagement with the topic to acknowledge that and to address it. But to your point, Janine, and I appreciate it, as we led into the negotiations last year, and it's funny to me to say last year because it feels like it was so long ago, but it was just last year that we began negotiating our first major contract with an AI focus as part of the negotiations. And that was what we call our TV theatrical agreement. It's the one that's with the major studios and streamers in the United States. And we've been focused on AI as a potential topic in those negotiations for several years. And we've actually been researching AI and looking at it for almost a decade. So as we were preparing for that negotiation, which would have been in the fall of 2022, just to set the technological context, this was before OpenAI had publicly announced or released ChatGPT. So at this point, the conversation about AI was at a much less intense level in the general public and just out in the community. And we were actively preparing for the need to negotiate over AI considerations in our negotiations that would begin in early 2023. In fact, we made our first public presentation on the topic of AI and its impact on the entertainment industry in the first week of December of 2022, which was only about 2 weeks after OpenAI publicly released the first iteration of ChatGPT, and the sort of cultural conversation about generative AI took off. As part of preparing for that, we knew that our members were going to be at the tip of the spear of implementation of AI technology. And we knew that because it had already been happening through early implementation of technology and using some workarounds. Our first concern about the use of AI, which is digital replication of human performers, had already been attempted. It had been attempted with more rudimentary technology in the form of CGI and other sort of technical cheats to try and make it happen. And in the time period right before this all went public, even some AI tools had been used to accomplish that. And this had been mainly done with fairly high profile performers, and mostly as a result of unavailability, often due to being deceased, for example. So, some notable examples of that include Paul Walker in the Fast and Furious movies, or Carrie Fisher in Star Wars, for example, and others. But we were well aware that that technology was becoming more and more economical, and therefore and more accessible to producers and companies and others, and that we fully expected that it would start to be used more frequently. And our members rightly had real concerns about that. So as we went into that negotiation, we formulated over many months a philosophy of how we would approach artificial intelligence as it related to the two major aspects of it that impacted our membership. And I think I might, if I may, just share a quick slide that goes along with that, just to illustrate that point. So the vision that we had as we approached this AI negotiation, especially as it related to digital replication, was two key sort of pillars of what we were looking to accomplish. First of all, to establish contractual right to informed consent over any kind of use of a performer's digital replica or digital identity. And that is to empower performers to say yes or no to any kind of use of that nature, and to do that with sufficient transparency and with sufficient understanding of what that consent meant and what it would be used for, that they actually had a meaningful opportunity to make those decisions. In the entertainment industry, and probably in other industries, but in the industry I work in, which is in the entertainment industry, there's a long tradition of consent forms that are just signed by people that say, I hereby give you the right to use my image, likeness, and voice in perpetuity throughout the universe by any means of technology now known or hereafter devised, and without any kind of real information about what that consent is. And our view was that's not real consent, because if you don't know what you're agreeing to, you aren't giving any kind of, you don't really have the choice of saying yes or no, because you don't know what you're saying yes or no to. So that has become the sort of bedrock principle underlying all the negotiations that we've done, and it's actually worked its way into public policy as well, is this concept of informed consent in an environment of transparency, and where the artist or where the worker or where the human being has a right to say a yes or no, a meaningful, real right to say yes or no. The second element that we were focused on was the concept of fair compensation. And that is establishing the principle, which to me seems like it should be obvious, but wasn't obvious to everyone necessarily, that if you're going to use someone's image, likeness, or voice, their digital identity, even if you're doing that without them physically doing something to create that output, that they should be entitled to be compensated for that. That especially in the case of our members, many of them have spent an entire career building the economic value of their persona, of their image, likeness, and voice, and that it is not right to take that and use it without fairly compensating them for that. Now, what constitutes fairness is obviously contextual, and so that is something that's defined in our agreement for this environment. But the fundamental principle is one that we felt really strongly about, and therefore embedded in our negotiations. And as you referenced, Janine, we went into those negotiations with an AI proposal, a very detailed and specific AI proposal. As far as I know, we were the first union, certainly in our industry, to go in with a detailed, extensive AI proposal. And it was one of the major issues that when the first round of bargaining came to a close on July 12th, unsuccessfully, it was one of the major issues where there had not been real progress. And it was one of the things that really made it clear to our members that the last resort of a strike was going to have to be used in order to achieve an agreement that our members could be comfortable moving forward with. And of course, that is precisely what happened. And that led us to the TV theatrical strike, and ultimately, thankfully, to the agreement that now in 2024 is in effect with respect to the studios and the streamers. And if I may, I'll just finish this rather lengthy answer to your very brief question by saying that the things that we accomplished in that negotiation ultimately, and if we want to talk more about the process, we can, because it was lengthy and it had a huge impact in the sense of a very harmful and damaging impact on the workers in the industry who were out of work for many months, as well as the industry itself. But what was accomplished with respect to AI in that negotiation and strike were, first of all, the protection of performer rights with respect to digital replication, including whether those replicas were created by being engaged to do scanning or some sort of physical action as part of a job, or whether they were independently acquired through a third-party vendor or something like that. Regardless of the source, under these agreements, the protections apply. And that may seem obvious, but it's actually really important from a labor perspective, because sometimes we were certainly worried that some companies might seek to evade those protections by circumventing a traditional employer-employee relationship and licensing the digital replica content from other sources or even from a performer. And so this ensures that regardless of any restructuring of the relationship like that, the contractual protections apply. Second of all, that includes detailed informed consent requirements, and the language that was ultimately, if you look at our agreement, and it's on our website, it's available for anyone to look at, all of our agreements are. If you look, you won't see the words informed consent, because what you'll see is the words reasonably specific description of intended use. And that is the contractual formulation of the concept of informed consent. So the idea being that if you're going to give any meaningful consent, you need to have a reasonably specific description of the intended use at the time you're granting consent. And then if there's a desire to go beyond that, then additional consent must be secured from you before they can proceed. There are detailed compensation structures that I won't go into in depth here, because I think the concept being that there is a definition of what type of compensation is considered fair under these circumstances at a minimum, and that's embedded in the agreement itself, as well as provisions relating to generative AI and synthetic performances. And this is something I haven't really touched on yet, but this was the other major concern besides digital replication that we had going into this negotiation, which is what would happen if a company decided to use one of the new, at the time, and still really, new generative AI tools to create a synthetic performer or performance that did not resemble in any way any actual person now living or whoever lived. And how does consent work in that scenario, and what does that mean? And so we certainly haven't finished bargaining this issue. This was probably one of the hardest issues to negotiate with the companies, because the companies are understandably themselves concerned about what their agreements with us might mean for their competitiveness in an industry that's developing so rapidly. But what we did establish is a contractual requirement for all of our signatory companies to notify us if they intend to create any synthetic performer using generative AI technology, and that establishing that we have a right to bargain over economic consideration or compensation for any such use. And for us, I think the purpose of that is twofold. One, to ensure that there is a source of funding for any kind of mitigation that might be needed in the event that synthetic performers or performances are disrupting the workplace. And second of all, we really want to always remember the unique human creative element that's part of what the work is that's done in this industry. Yes, it's an industry. Yes, it's a business. It's a big business, but it is based upon the unique creative contribution of humans. And therefore, in our structuring of these business relationships, we do not wish to encourage the replacement of humans with synthetic outputs. We think that a good use for AI is augmentation, is helping to streamline processes, giving creative artists additional tools to work with that didn't exist before. But replacing creativity with algorithmic processing is not something that we want to encourage. And we feel that we can use economic structures to help disincentivize that. And this is a first step in that direction. So with those things having been accomplished and that agreement approved in November of last year, we then launched into a whole series of other negotiations where we've evolved upon those terms. But that was sort of the starting point. And just on a personal note, if I may say, it was an extraordinary period of time where the support of our sibling unions in the industry and in the labor movement, in not just in the United States, but around the world, as well as the support of the public for the sort of goal of what we're trying to accomplish, was incredibly crucial to achieving a good outcome.
All right, wonderful. But I understand that now you are also in another strike ongoing right now with video game producers on similar issues, well, the issue of digital replicas. So is it that you're trying to have the same outcome that was negotiated in this last contract agreement, this other contract agreement, in that agreement, and they're resisting, or there are some other issues that are particular to the video game industry?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. So yes, we are on strike against the video game industry now. We have been since the end of July, so it's also been a very lengthy strike already. In this strike, the AI issues are even more crystallized, because in the strike last year, although AI took center stage with a lot of the public because it was the issue that seemed most broadly relevant to people, There were other big issues in that strike as well, besides AI. For example, um, increasing compensation to account for inflation, changing the compensation structure for the streaming industry, which had not evolved to address the changed business model and was leaving our members behind. So things like that. In this negotiation with the video game companies, the sole issue in this strike is AI. All other economic issues were resolved before the strike began. And the only issue that we have been bargaining over with them since the strike began is artificial intelligence and its implementation in the video game industry. And the principles we're fighting for are precisely the same. They're the informed consent and fair compensation principles that we just talked about. And one of the things that I think has been so frustrating and challenging about that process is the sense that so many other companies within our broader industry ambit, not just the studios and streamers, but since then, the television animation producers, the major record labels, a whole host of individual companies we've done agreements with, have all begun embracing the core concepts of informed consent and fair compensation for digital replication. In fact, the informed consent model has now been enacted as law in California, in Tennessee. We have a federal bill in Congress in the United States to further establish that right of informed consent for the use of people's image, voice, and likeness. And so there's clearly a developing consensus within our industry and more broadly in public policy circles around this concept. And yet, for whatever reason, the video game companies are resisting that. And I think they've become more isolated over the months, even that we've been on strike, as more and more companies sign on to the concepts that we're pushing for. But yeah, they, I think, for several reasons, have been unwilling to fully embrace the concept of informed consent and fair compensation for all of the performers who work for them. And as a union, of course, we're not going to leave any of our members behind. So although they have offered pieces of informed consent and fair compensation to certain performers who work for them, we really feel that all workers deserve a baseline of AI protections, and certainly all performers likewise deserve to have those fundamental protections in place. And that's why we're still on strike after all these months now.
But you have been more successful with the voice actors, if I understand. You have an agreement with Ethovox and Narrative. Is that also along the same lines? Is there something particular to that to that type of work?
Well, the video game contract is a large part of it is voice acting because, of course, that's a big part of the video game deal. So until we have that contract resolved, we certainly, are facing challenges for voice actors. And I think voice actors are of all of the forms of acting are at the very leading edge of the impact of AI because, frankly, from a technical point of view, the technology is easier to implement in a voice-only environment. And that has slowed the pace a little bit of implementation of some of these tools in audiovisual, whereas in audio specifically, they've moved forward very quickly. Having said that, Ethovox is a great example. You pick two great examples of individual, what we would call specialized agreements that we've done with companies that are specifically focused on AI, as opposed to our broader, more general agreements that we do with, for example, the record labels or the studios and streamers. So Ethovox is particularly interesting. It's one of our newest, and maybe our very newest agreement. It's just done in the end of last month. And Ethovox is a company that is looking to create the world's first, I think, fully documented ethical AI model, foundational model, using entirely fully consented inputs as the training data for their foundational model. And this is very exciting because, of course, one of the big challenges that I think we see has been the fact that in their zeal to move the technology forward and in their competitive zeal, a lot of AI companies have resorted to just taking content that they find online or from whatever source and just using it with no consent, certainly no compensation, no license, just dumping it into their training data and just using it and figuring that they'll deal with the consequences later. From the point of view of people who who spend their lives creating extraordinary works of art and unique contributions to our culture, the idea that someone can just take that and use it without your consent or involvement is really wrong. And so Ethovox is approaching this a different way, which is all of their inputs are fully consented, subject to our collective bargaining agreement with them. The voice their approach at the present time is a voice acting model, and so that means that those voices that are used in their foundational model are all voice actors who have consented, who know exactly what the scope of the consent is that they're granting, who are compensated for that use, and who have the right at various points in time to be asked again for consent for the continued participation in this development of a foundational model. Now, Ethovox's, their output is not sort of end user facing. Their output is the foundational model that can then be further trained for specific iterations. And that's just as important. It's actually more important in a way because it provides the infrastructure that other companies can use to do this the right way with fully consented AI tools. So that's the Ethovox negotiation. And that took a long time to work out because it is both technical and also something that's never really been done yet before. But we're really proud of that agreement, and I'm excited that that company is pushing forward. It's a company that's led by voice actors, actually, and that's extraordinary. The other one you mentioned is called Narrative. This is an online platform for the creation of audio commercials for digital use. The thing that's interesting about this platform, I think, is that when you, as an actor, participate in this platform, you sign up and then you provide them with a certain amount of data to train a digital replica on your own voice. Then that digital replica exists within their system, and advertisers who want to use advertisers can basically come to their platform and check out what voice actors are available through their platform, and they can decide who they want to engage for a particular campaign. Then they upload that campaign into the system. Then it is sent to you as the actor to decide if you want to consent to being part of their campaign or not. And in granting that consent, you not only get to see the full script of what your digital replica would be saying, but you can actually listen to the digital replica's performance because it's been created already in the system. You can listen to that performance and decide if you want to say yes or no to it. And all of that happens through an automated online platform. In addition to that, this is a collective, union collective bargaining agreement that people are working under. So they get their benefits like health insurance and retirement. And also the performer has the right to set whatever rate they want to set for that work. And of course, the engaging advertiser can decide whether to agree to that or not. So there's an online negotiation subject to union minimum compensation requirements that occurs. And so it really empowers the performer to decide exactly how and when their digital replica is used and whether they like the digital replica performance and want it to be out there using their voice. I think the last point about that I'll just make is one of the things that's so great about this particular agreement is if a performer is part of the platform and then decides at some point they don't want to be part of this digital marketplace anymore, they have the right to withdraw from the platform. And if they choose to do that, the company has the obligation to destroy all the digital replica materials that have been created, not for campaigns that are obviously been paid for and that are out there, but for the creation of any future digital replica materials that has to be destroyed and purged from their database. And so essentially the performer can at any time decide, I don't want to do this anymore, and safely walk away without worrying that now somebody else can just compete with them by creating replicas of them without their consent and without compensation.
Right. Fascinating. It's really some really comprehensive guardrails in that contract. Let me switch a little bit and talk a little bit about the technological shifts that have been going on in the industry. I mean, I think your industry has been one of a long history of technological shifts. But recently I was reading a New York Times article about this new Tom Hanks movie called Here, which uses AI technology, and him and the other lead actor are basically, they go from age 20 to age 80 in the film. using technology, which on the one hand is kind of nice, but on the other hand, it means that, you know, in the past, there would have been a younger Tom Hanks that would have been cast, that is no longer cast. So there's certainly definitely a job implication there. So I wanted to get a little bit of a feel from SAG-AFTRA's position on some of those uses of technology and where you think actually there is, you know, positive potential for the use of AI or other technologies in the industry.
Sure. I think you know, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head that this is an example of the kind of disruption that is going to happen. I mean, no one should think that even with the best possible collectively bargained outcomes or public policy rules, that this is going to be a non-disruptive process of integrating AI technology into our industry, because it is going to be disruptive. And our responsibility, in my view, is to try and channel and limit that disruption as much as possible, make it as supportive of human creativity and human artists as we can, recognizing that we can't stop the advance of technology. And I've been asked many times by people, why are we engaging with these companies? Why are we developing these rules? Why aren't we saying, no AI, ban AI, don't have AI, we shouldn't do it, it's horrible. And I respect the fact that people have that view and have the view that AI shouldn't be used in the industry. But the reality is, just like the invention of the internet, the invention of motion pictures, the invention of electricity, these are technologies that exist. And past history shows that unions who spend all of their energy trying to stop the advance of technology, A, lose, and B, miss the opportunity. I think even more important than losing is missing the opportunity to use that leverage and influence to channel how that conversation happens and how those technologies are implemented. So that's our main reasoning for acknowledging that disruption and focusing on how we can improve upon it. I think the example that you gave is particularly relevant because one way of looking at it, of course, is that there might have been other actors engaged to portray Tom Hanks at different ages. Of course, we've seen pre-AI examples of movies where makeup and special effects have been used to create that same sort of thing without engaging other actors. So it's a bit speculative. Of course, those tools and technologies can impact people beyond just performers. Obviously, my mandate is to represent performers, but people like makeup artists, people like, you know, hair professionals, people like crew of all different types within the industry can be impacted too, as AI tools are used in ways that change how their jobs are performed. So this is part of a larger pattern of disruption that we see not only in our industry, although I think we've been among the first and most visible examples, but something that's happening across a wide range of industries, whether it's algorithmic management of employees, whether it's AI surveillance of employee activities. There's all kinds of implementations of AI that really affect workers, how they experience their work lives, whether their jobs exist or in what way their job exists, and that implicate workers' rights to have a say in how AI is implemented in their workplace, and especially when it's aggregating data about them, for example, their health or their work patterns or other things like that. The importance of having the right of consent over the collection and use of that kind of information.
Great. Well, Duncan, it's really fascinating to listen to you. And, you know, as I was preparing for this interview, I looked up when the last strike of Hollywood actors took place, and it was in 1980, which was actually a year before I was born. So it took 43 years for the next issue that serious to emerge. And the previous strike was also about technology, but at the time it was about video cassettes and pay television. And here we are 43 years later with a technology that seems so important, that and the dispute that is so important around it. But some of those changes are not only around AI, but also around other technological advancements. For example, shift to streaming. And what do you think are some of those other technological, especially digital technology impacts as important as AI, or is really AI the biggest impact currently that you see?
Well, it's always tempting to think that the times we live in are the biggest challenge that anyone's ever seen. I think that's a refrain that's very common. I think it's worth noting in the film and television part of our world, the big strikes we've had have all been around major technological changes. And you mentioned the 1980 strike, which is a great example of that. The strike before that was in 1960. And that was the last time that both the Writers Guild and SAG, at the time Screen Actors Guild, went on strike in connection with the film and television industry. And at that time, it was about the new technology of actually rerunning performances on television. We forget because it seems like it's existed forever, but television had not existed forever. And Screen Actors Guild started as a union of performers who worked in film, and the other part of our union, AFTRA, started as a union that represented performers in radio. And there were great clashes in the 50s and up until 1960 over the impact of the development of television, which of course in a way was, if you take film and take radio, combine them, and you kind of have television. And so there have been these kinds of major strikes have historically been driven, at least in the entertainment industry, by massive technological changes and the need to really battle over how they will be affected and implemented. And whether AI is, I think from a social point of view, AI is probably a broader, more impactful technological change. This is why, the people at the World Economic Forum are calling it the fourth industrial revolution. I think a lot of people see it as something that is, and certainly our members saw it during that negotiation and now, as existential to their future career. I think that's possible that back in those days, which I wasn't around for, people saw the advent of television, or perhaps the advent of motion pictures. If you were a stage actor, in the late 1800s, and here comes motion pictures, that probably felt like an existential threat to your career as a stage actor. Of course, Broadway is thriving nonetheless, and live performance remains a crucial part of the entertainment industry, notwithstanding the creation of those technologies. So I think if we take a longer term and bigger picture perspective, the proper and beneficial use of AI technology will be enhancement and augmentation of the industry and of creative work within the industry, and not as replacement. I think it would be a huge, huge mistake for the companies involved in this industry, and I've said this to their CEOs, to really encourage the public to overly embrace mediocre outputs that might be generated algorithmically that lack the unique spark of human creativity. And when you think about the most impactful performances that you've seen in your lifetime, whether they're musical performances, live theater, movies, television, those performances all have something that's unique about them. They're not just the same thing you've seen before, and that's what makes them so special. And that is something that AI is not great at. AI is great at a number of things, but the unique creativity that humans bring, maybe our unique experiences in life, are things that can't really be replicated. And I remember during the Writers Guild strike, actually last year, actually during both of our strikes, the writers always had the best picket signs. And one that has really resonated with me, and I think a lot of other people, is a sign we saw on the picket lines that said, ChatGPT doesn't have childhood trauma. And I think it's true, because part of our lived experiences as humans are what make things so special. And that is something that cannot be and probably never will be replicated through any algorithmic system or generative AI process.
Well, I have to say that, yes, indeed, the prospect of mediocre and repetitive content in arts and entertainment is really scary, actually, as you describe it. And I wanted to ask you about another phenomenon that's out there, which is basically this rise in user-generated content. So there are many people who find content on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok from performers who put it there. And I saw on your page that SAG-AFTRA offers membership and services to influencers. So I wanted to ask you about that, and what's your approach in general to this type of user-generated content?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think we have to recognize that new platforms exist that really provide an avenue for creative expression that is similar fundamentally to what our members do. And that's not to say that everything that's on TikTok or YouTube is that, because it certainly isn't. I'm a regular participant in those platforms, and there's a lot of, to be perfectly honest, mediocre and repetitive content that you find. But there are also extraordinarily talented artists and performers who are engaged in those platforms, who've used the tools that those platforms provide to really experiment and express their creativity. And so we recognize this. And so we do have an influencer agreement that's designed for content creators and influencers. This is still in its early stages, even for us. And so that agreement is really focused on brand deals that companies have where they sponsor creators and influencers to do content, and gives those influencers and creators the chance to do that under a union collective bargaining agreement with benefit contributions, et cetera. But the long-term vision really is to encompass not only branded content, but also all the types of creative expression that are embodied on these platforms. And during our strike last year, we really did reach out to the creator and influencer community because we recognize their talent. And so did the studios and streamers, by the way. The second that we went on strike on July 12th, once our members were no longer available due to our strike order to promote movies and television series, et cetera, the very first thing that the studios and streamers did was start reaching out to creators and influencers and trying to entice them to fill in for our striking members and promote movies and other projects that were going to be released. And I will eternally be grateful to the hundreds and hundreds of influencers and creators who, even the ones who weren't members of SAG-AFTRA themselves, who stood with us, turned down those opportunities, sometimes at great cost to themselves, because they were supporting the fight that we were in. And so certainly it is part of our strategy to ensure that everyone who brings that level of talent and creativity to their work in front of a camera, behind a microphone, is represented by SAG-AFTRA, and that we can collectively work to establish the kind of contracts and protections that everyone deserves. And I will just note, when you're an individual artist and you're up against a massive corporation, that is a major power imbalance. And history shows the best way to level that playing field is to get together with other artists and bargain collectively and establish those rules, because even the most powerful and famous performers have a challenge in fighting those battles individually with these companies. But when we all stand together, I think last year exemplifies the fact that that unity and that solidarity brings immense power and the ability to actually level the playing field, even with giant corporate interests. And in our world these days, that's the reality of the fight. Corporations have grown larger and larger, more and more multinational, and they have tremendous power. And so for workers to be able to hold their own, we have to come together and speak with a united voice.
So I want to take this conversation a little bit more to the regulation part, and especially the IP rights. So intellectual property, a lot depends on that. And I have a feeling that part of the success in the negotiations, also by the Writers Guild of America, was also the guidance of the US Copyright Office that was issued in March 2023, which stated that copyright can protect only material that is the product of human creativity. Now, is that the case in other jurisdictions, or is this a very specific situation that you are dealing with? And what are the potential consequences for others if that's not the case elsewhere? How do you see that?
Well, I think the good news for human creators of all kinds is that it seems to me that that is a developing norm. If we look at copyright authorities around the world, that does seem to be currently the predominant viewpoint, is that works that are created primarily with artificial intelligence are not necessarily eligible for copyright protection. And I do think that's important. We think that's collectively important. And by the way, it's not just us that thinks that. In the US, or actually, I think it's even broader than the US, we have a campaign called the Human Artistry Campaign, which is specifically focused on intellectual property rights and the fact that the underpinnings, the foundation of intellectual property is the human creative contribution to that intellectual property. If you actually look at the principles underlying copyright, but also patents, for example, there is that creative element that needs to be present and that uniqueness in order for them to qualify for intellectual property protection. And certainly our Copyright Office has explicitly stated that this is not only a statutory principle in copyright, but it's undergirded by the US Constitution, which established the concept of intellectual property law in the United States at its inception. So from my point of view, this is of crucial importance, but the partners in that campaign are not just unions or creative workers. One of the founding partners of that campaign was the major record labels in the United States, which obviously, they are in the business of copyrighted distributing copyrighted works, but they also recognize that their business is fundamentally based on the human creativity that their artists bring as part of the relationship between the record label and musical performers, and that damaging or destroying that relationship by enabling sort of algorithmic content to be treated on the same level as human creative output is not in the long-term interests of the industry or the people who work in it.
So I'm going to stay on this topic just for a little bit more. And if I take you a bit out of your comfort zone, then just feel free to tell me.
I'm used to it, don't worry.
But I'd like to talk a little bit more outside of the US context about the context of developing countries. So, of course, in many countries, the IP regulations might be weaker, but also the awareness of artists or performers of their IP rights might be lower. And the question of informed consent and compensation introduces itself very differently, I think, if these regulations differ drastically from the context in which you are working. But I know you were also involved in the technical meeting on the future of work in the arts and entertainment sector at the ILO in February 2023, which ended up with a whole lot of interesting conclusions. And I'm wondering whether you see a path for unions like SAG-AFTRA to collaborate with international bodies like the ILO, like WIPO, to set international norms that could help protect workers in those industries outside of the US and especially in developing countries.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you raised that, Pawel, because I think that's absolutely crucial. And one of the conclusions from that technical meeting that you mentioned was a recommendation that the ILO and other international bodies, specifically named, if I remember correctly, were UNESCO was one of them and WIPO was another, but not to the exclusion of other international bodies as well, that it was essential for that joint work to happen because of the impact across these different traditional areas of responsibility, whether that's labor rights or whether that's intellectual property rights or just the cultural industries as a general concept. And certainly the protection of indigenous culture is another element there. From my point of view, norm setting is crucial and it's crucial for it to happen at the international level, because what we do not want is to have companies opportunistically relocating their operations for the purpose of evading basic fundamental protective norms. And I do think that this applies equally to people in developing parts of the world, because I think they are as vulnerable, if not more so, to the kind of exploitation that we are concerned about happening in the absence of meaningful AI regulation. So it's certainly not about stifling the development of AI industries or technologies in countries around the world. It's about having a baseline, a fundamental respect for humans that should apply to everyone everywhere, and no one should be primed to be exploited by that technology or by companies looking to implement that technology. And to your point, while obviously we come from a performer perspective, and that helps motivate us and drive our perspective on issues, things like basic protections for the right to control the use of your image, likeness, and voice are things that really resonate with people far beyond the world of performers. We currently have a bill in Congress in the United States that's called the No Fakes Act. It was driven by deepfake technology, but really what it fundamentally is establishing and recognizing an intellectual property right that individuals have in their face, their voice, their likeness. And this is really important because this applies to everyone. It's not just actors or performing artists, but it's also if you are a public official, if you are a health official, for goodness sake, if you are just someone who shares your opinions online, if you're a journalist, just all different types of people can have their image, voice, and likeness taken and used without their consent. And it not only can create economic damage to them, but also forces them to be aligned with views that they may not agree with. In my case, I personally was deepfaked last year during the ratification campaign for our contract. After this negotiation ended and the strike ended, we had about a 3-week period of debate within our members before there was going to be a vote on our contract. And that was a very public thing that was happening. And so somebody grabbed video of me without any permission and created a deepfake version of me saying false things about the contract that were designed to make people want to vote against it. And so I can tell you, obviously, that's wrong on so many levels, but to see your own face and voice being used online, let's say, to advocate for something that's the exact opposite of what you believe in, that has an impact that is very real beyond the economic impact. And I think that's something that resonates with everyone, not wanting to have words put in their mouth that they don't agree with. So I think this is something that hopefully we should be able to build consensus around. We have bipartisan support for it in the United States, which is saying something if you're familiar with our political system. And I hope that it can also gain a wide range of support at the international level as maybe a start to norm setting that could occur. We've been doing a lot of information gathering, and rightly so, but I do think we're moving into a moment in time where norm setting should begin.
Yeah, that is a very scary vision that you outline of deepfakes, of course, and I can't imagine the feeling of finding yourself in this situation. But so we know that in many cases technology can have very many negative sides, but it can also, the same technology can be used to protect workers' rights. And we've seen that with, for example, e-formalization and digital technologies. And I'm wondering whether you have some thoughts about the use of AI and associated technologies to protect workers' rights. For example, automated recognition of content that was AI created based on someone's original input, or different forms of digital stamping. There were even some discussions about applying technologies like blockchain, maybe linked with AI recognition, to basically provide some kind of a digital stamp and recognition over time, as well as trace compensation to performers. Do you have any thoughts on this kind of positive use of technology for the protection of workers' rights in this industry?
Absolutely. I mean, another way of putting it is we're just as eager to use AI technology to advance the performer interest side as the companies or others are interested in using it to advance their economic interests. So you gave great examples of what that could include. It definitely could include detection of unauthorized use. So, whether that's in the form of deepfakes or in the form of uncompensated or unauthorized use that's done in a more traditional way. It also, I think, provides the opportunity, like you said, to really streamline, make more efficient, and make more accurate the compensation systems that have been built into the industry, rather than having to restructure them completely. If the technology can morph to better support those structures, that could both lower industry costs and therefore hopefully make more money available for additional jobs in production, but also make those payments more reliable and accurate. One of the things that I think is also really exciting that we haven't talked as much about, but is the possibility, we talked a little bit earlier about the Tom Hanks example with aging and de-aging. But another possibility for the use of AI technology is to provide more access to employment for performers with disabilities. And I think that's something that we're really eager to see more resources go into the development of those kinds of tools, because the fact is that there's been a huge lack of employment opportunities, a huge gap for performers with disabilities, and also in many cases a practice of non-disabled performers being cast in roles that are portraying disabled performers. But what I would love to see happen is more opportunities for the reverse to happen, which is with the use of AI technology enabling disabled performers to be cast in roles that previously they might not have been considered for. So there are, like you said, beneficial uses of technology and detrimental uses of technology. And I think one of the refrains that we had last year that I've continued to just hammer on is the fact that AI is being implemented by humans. It doesn't implement itself. It has not yet taken over the world and made those decisions. So people decide how AI is going to be implemented and used. And as workers and as just members of the public, we absolutely must come together, raise our voices, and insist that those decisions be made in the interests of humans and hold people accountable for making good decisions about the implementation of AI, because we absolutely can do that if we stay focused on it, we pay attention, and we use our voices and find our power.
Wonderful. It's really been really fascinating. So I'm going to take a few questions that came in from the audience. We have a question here from Margarita Licata. She's saying, when it comes to AI, there's a need to ensure the necessary synergies between copyright and labor protections. So how can policymakers and industry stakeholders ensure that copyright protections and labor protections in the entertainment industry are in synergy rather than in isolation in the age of AI, to both safeguard intellectual property rights of creators and support basic labor protections, such as labor rights, job security, and fair remuneration for the cultural professionals? So what strategies can help bridge any gaps between these two areas to create a cohesive framework that benefits everyone?
What a great question. And I agree completely with the fundamental point that that individual is making. We've been describing this as a mosaic of protection. But what we mean by that is that no one source can provide the overall level of protection and confidence that artists and really all of us need in a world where AI is so deeply engaged. And so for us, that looks like collective bargaining combined with public policy, combined with member and public education and engagement. And really, with those three pieces all taken together and working harmoniously with each other, that is how we ultimately achieve those goals. So as a concrete example, one of the things that we've seen is we worked very hard to devise the language around informed consent. We then bargained that language with industry stakeholders, and it made its way into our collective bargaining agreement. And it then was lifted from our collective bargaining agreement and put into multiple laws, some of which we helped draft and others which were done by other people without our involvement. And now the concept of reasonably specific description of intended use is becoming a norm that's established not just in our collective bargaining agreements, but in the public policy around that space. And I say that as an example of how we can negotiate the challenge of harmonizing labor rights and intellectual property rights, because it absolutely can be done. But what it requires is forums where all of the key stakeholders participate on an equal basis. And this is something that I've been advocating for very strongly. I had the chance to participate in the World Economic Forum last year in Davos. And some of my members asked me, like, why are we there? Like, why is this a worthwhile use of your time? And my response to that is, there are a lot of decisions being made by particularly corporations that are implementing AI technology or government policymakers who are in forums where these conversations happen. And if we want to harmonize labor rights and worker rights with these kinds of discussions, labor and worker representatives need to be present and part of that dialogue. And being part of that dialogue helps us to ensure that those are implemented in a consistent manner. So that happened at the ILO and the technical meeting that we were talking about in February of 2023. Really, I don't think that meeting was set up because of AI. In fact, I know it wasn't, because I remember the discussions about whether AI would be on the agenda. And in fact, probably people here will be amused to recall that that was actually a question at that time. There was a discussion that I was part of about whether, as the workers group, we would be looking to push to have AI as a topic of conversation at that meeting, because we were deciding what the agenda was going to be in the fall of 2022. Now, looking back on it, I think we all would, I mean, if you were having that meeting today, there'd be no doubt that AI would be on the agenda. It would probably be a significant part of the agenda. So I think a lot has changed in that time period, but having those kind of conversations in every forum is how we're going to harmonize those rights. And I think, but those rights absolutely can be harmonized. There is no fundamental conflict, in my view, between authors' rights, copyright, related rights, and workers' rights, as long as the discussions about their implementation ensures that workers' needs and concerns are taken into account as part of that broader norm setting process. And I would direct people's attention to, just as examples of that, the Beijing Treaty for the Protection of Audiovisual Performances, which is a WIPO treaty that was finalized in 2012. And before it, the WPPT, the WIPO Performances and Phonograms treaties, both of which are treaties that both address intellectual property rights and related rights, but also do so in the context of protecting workers and their creative contributions in both the music and the audiovisual performance industry. So I think it's a great point, and if we remain mindful about it, stay focused, we can absolutely harmonize those issues.
I think we will be slowly wrapping up the session, but there are a few more questions that I will just ask from the audience. But maybe before that, just to say that a lot of things that you say about the use of technology really resonates with what Janine and I have been writing in the papers, in some of the research that we published since last year, especially this complementarity of use of technology and human skills. Also, in the same series, we had some time ago Darren Acemoglu, one of the top economists, who also talked about it, how not only how it basically makes sense in macroeconomic terms to look for this type of use more generally beyond the performing arts and in the use of AI and work. But there are two questions here that I want to ask you. One is short. It's about the number of unionized workers in the video games industry. And the second was about this opt-in and out that you talked about, but maybe it's worth briefly sort of reinforcing or explaining, how does it work in practice? So if I opt out as a performer, what does it mean? What do I lose? What do I risk missing out? And is it easy to opt in and out, or is this a concept that's rather fluid and hard to actually safeguard?
Thanks. So as to the first question, the video game industry is not as union dense or not as full of union represented employees as the film and television industry is, for sure, at least in the United States. Our members who work for the video game companies doing performance, on camera and vocal performance, are unionized broadly across the industry, and certainly all of the major video game companies that we're on strike against and that we bargain with, those companies, all of their projects that are made involving performers are union covered performers. But when you talk about the developers, for example, that are a huge part of the workforce of video game companies, they traditionally haven't been unionized, although there is an active organizing campaign, a couple of them going on right now, with a couple of major unions in the United States who are looking to organize and represent developers, because they have often been forced to work under rather extreme conditions, with the kinds of crunch workloads that are really not right. And so we certainly are supporting those organizing campaigns by other unions who are looking to increase union representation in the workforce of video game companies. So I think that's that is a work in progress, and we certainly hope to see expanding union density across all types of workers in the video game industry, and certainly we'll continue to fight our battles for performers who work for those companies to make sure that they are protected from AI, and also with respect to all the other sort of workplace issues that we see. And I'm so sorry, Pawel, because I didn't have the ability to write it down. Can you remind me what the second question was?
It was about opt-in and out.
Oh, right.
How it works in practice, what you miss out on, and is it sort of a fluid concept, or is it something that you have to decide on and sort of take the consequences of it?
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. We didn't frame it as opt-in or opt-out, but you're absolutely right. I mean, our collectively bargained consent system is fundamentally a opt-in system because the producer, the employer, whoever's creating the project, has a affirmative obligation to come to you and secure your consent before using you as a performer in any kind of digital replication or AI tool, with the exception of certain specific types of digital alteration that we agreed could be done without separate consent. Things along the lines of things that could have been done using traditional editing methods or things of that nature, minor alterations. But for any kind of major use, it is essentially an opt-in system. And the consequence is, if you choose to decline consent, then the producer has a decision to make, which is, can they and do they want to go forward without having the ability to use AI technology with respect to your performance or not? And if they decide that they can't or won't do that, then they may decide to hire someone else who is willing to grant that consent. And that was a big part of the conversation, because it's sort of like the question was raised during our contract ratification: can the employer make this a condition of employment that you consent to digital replication? And the answer to that question is yes. If they have a legitimate reason to need to use digital replication, they can make that a condition of employment. However, that has to be done at the time the initial employment is negotiated. And if somebody is hired, let's say, to work in a movie or a television project, and then later on the company says, oh, well, we want you to do this, that, or the other through digital replication, if you decline that consent, then if the company decides to go a different direction with that role, they still, under our contracts, will have to pay you for that work nonetheless. So really, one of the things that this contract structure drives is the need for employers to plan ahead and to really communicate with the actors that they're looking to cast from the very beginning about what the expectations are for that particular role. And so that's how that works. And I think we've seen other systems, opt-out systems, notably the EU AI Act really is fundamentally more of an opt-out type of approach. As an artist and human creative talent representative, obviously, I prefer an opt-in approach because I don't feel that the burden should be placed on the artist to have to proactively opt out of things. I think that if someone wants to use your image, likeness, or voice, or your prior creative contributions to the world, that they should have to, the burden should be on them to come to you and secure your consent, not the other way around. But frankly, at least some form of requirement for consent is a huge step forward, because what we should all remember is, 4 years ago, there was basically nothing. There was no contractual limitations. There were no public policy limitations. A lot has been accomplished in a short time. And I try to remind myself of that when I think about how far we have to go. And I think about the fact that 2 years ago, we had 0 pages of contractual rules relating to AI and digital replication and its use in film and television. And now we have 16, and we'll be going on from there.
Yeah, no, I think what you've accomplished is absolutely amazing, because it's clear that it's not something that's just, obviously it's a benefit for your 160,000 members, but it's also been a benefit for other people in the creative industries and perhaps, other people as well. And it certainly reverberates across the world. So I think
I hope so. I think it can. I think it has the potential to be. And if we all work to encourage each other, I think everyone can can help move the ball forward. And in fact, in our, we have an international group called FIA, the International Federation of Actors, where all the actors unions in the world, we talk. And, we all always cheer each other on, because as every union can build upon what we've done before, and then we can build upon what they've done, it helps us advance the cause. And the fundamental power of this is persistence and staying focused on our short, mid, and long-term goals. And in collective bargaining, we get to come back to the table regularly and continue to move things forward. And so as hard as it may be to believe, it'll be just a little bit more than a year from now that we'll be back preparing for the next round of negotiation with the studios and streamers, which undoubtedly will include further discussions regarding AI.
Wonderful. So definitely takes a lot of tenacity that you have. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been really great having this conversation with you, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you to you, Janine and Pawel. I really appreciate all the great questions. What a great conversation.
Thanks for this great discussion, Duncan. It's been really a pleasure listening.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
The AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.